Fine. Oh, you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's 11, and we're going to start our discussion on Russian disinformation and propaganda about Ukraine. My name is Arina. I'm almost a graduated master's student at the University of Oslo and a research assistant here at BRIO. This event has been devised in the aftermath of my thesis, which is titled Ukrainians, Brothers, Enemies, or Russians? Russian propaganda on state-owned television about Ukraine in 2010, 2013, and 2021. To my right is Professor Stephen Hutchins from the University of Manchester in the UK, who is an expert on Russian disinformation and propaganda globally, as well as Russian culture. Then next to him is Pavel Bayev, a research professor here at BRIO and an expert on Russian policy. And at the far corner is Professor Nick Marsh, a senior researcher here at BRIO. And he's going to moderate the discussion. So the word is yours.
Thanks very much, Arina. So I'd like to start with a quick question for Stephen, and that's: could you briefly describe, how you define disinformation, because it can be quite a slippery subject.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm tempted to give an hour-long lecture. I'd be perfectly capable of doing so, but
just a few minutes.
I shan't. Yeah. As you say, the term has been and is used inconsistently and somewhat incoherently. So even if you take definitions across the Atlantic Ocean, in America, they tend to use misinformation as a kind of umbrella term, and disinformation is seen as a particular variety of misinformation, whereas in Britain, and I think more generally in Europe, we make a distinction between misinformation and disinformation. I think the whole kind of lexicon is fraught and very problematic. There is, I think, a reasonably tight and coherent definition, which I'll give you. There are problems with that definition, which I'll also briefly describe, and then quickly, if there's time, I'll offer some possible solutions. A reasonably tight definition is that disinformation is a claim or set of claims about the world or about actors or events in the world that are factually false, deliberately intended to deceive, and capable of causing significant harm. You may ask why that last criterion. You're probably familiar with the other two. The last criterion is so that the definition passes what I call the Santa Claus test. We all tell our children, up to a certain age, that there's this fellow called Santa Claus who lives at the North Pole and delivers presents on Christmas Eve every year. It's not true. At least I don't think it is. Maybe in Norway you've got more insights into that. And it is designed to deceive. But it would be difficult to argue that it's capable of causing harm. So that definition kind of works. The problem, well, there are several problems with it. One is, when you apply it in practice, there are actually fairly few examples that meet all three criteria. Some that do, or that come close. So, for example, if we're talking about Ukraine, they claim that the catastrophe in Mariupol was caused by Ukrainian soldiers shooting at their own citizens. I would thought that comes pretty close to meeting all three criteria. Whereas if you take a claim like the thoroughly kind of objectionable and imperialistic and aggressive notion that Ukraine is actually part of Russia's historical heartlands, and that therefore Ukraine doesn't really exist properly as a country, as I say, it's utterly and totally reprehensible and morally and ideologically objectionable, but you'd have difficulty getting it to meet those three criteria. So there's a problem of practical application, and if we're not careful, if we apply that, we'll end up letting Russia off the hook in instances where it definitely does not need to be let off the hook. But there are other problems. How do you actually prove intent to deceive, particularly in an online domain where kind of forms of deception are kind of routine practice? How do you actually prove intent to deceive? And also, facts are slippery. The same fact can be quoted and cited to mean and to make very, very different messages. Again, I'm sure you can all think of examples, but the last problem, the fourth problem, is probably the most serious of them all, which is that the term disinformation is itself a term of practice, and it is used in accusatory polemics right across the political sphere. So only yesterday I was reading of Conservative and Labour spokesmen in Parliament accusing one another of disinformation. Its history is of a term that is used as a way of diminishing and othering an opponent. And I don't think that there's nothing wrong with that as a tool of political discourse. But I think as an analyst, we need to develop a tool set that is not tainted by its use and abuse in political discourse. So what are the answers? There's one very quick and easy and obvious answer. When I have to talk in these terms, I tend to prefer propaganda or state propaganda. Propaganda is a much more capacious, much more fluid and flexible term that allows for the inclusion of falsehood, intent, but doesn't necessarily depend on it. That too has problems associated with it. That too is a term of polemical discourse. So in the long term, my view is that we need to develop a whole kind of meta-language that is free of those associations. But in the short term, I think propaganda rather than disinformation generally works better for our purposes.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So I'd like to move on to an issue in which there was a great deal of harm caused, and that's the narratives about Ukraine in Russian state-owned media prior to the 2022 invasion. So Irina first. Concerning domestic Russian television coverage, what narratives or propaganda were used in 2021? And do you think the Russian population was being prepared in advance for the invasion?
Yes, thank you for the question, Nick. It certainly was, but not as one would expect. When I looked at the coverage at the first sight, there was overwhelming negativity and demonization of how Ukraine and Ukrainians were portrayed. Especially the Ukrainian government or Kiev regime, so to speak, as well as the Ukrainian army and radical members of the society who resurfaced in the aftermath of Maidan in 2013, were criminalized consistently throughout the year. They were called criminals, they were called monsters who threaten, endanger, and kill their own people. And the emphasis on Nazism was obviously very strong. There was also a very clear alignment between this sort of demonization and how the medium communicated it visually. There were, for example, instances of rapid montage of Nazi symbols and dramatic music with commentary about what each symbol means. There was mocking and insulting of the Ukrainian government and army. For example, they both were called Banderite government and regime's attack dogs. Zelensky was being called a boy in shorts, a clown, and much worse words and phrases that I will not repeat here. Images of aggressive people toppling statues, throwing Nazi salutes, presidential units in Ukraine bearing a Nazi collaborator with honors and with red and black flags which symbolize Ukrainian nationalism. It was all over the coverage, which is the demonization of the enemy. This is what you usually do if you want to start an invasion. But there was, in addition to that demonization, surprising positivity too. One of the findings of my qualitative, and I emphasize this, research is the new narrative that coexists with all this demonization and that I call Ukrainians as Russians. So what does this narrative entail? Its clear indicator is the use of such phrases as one people, united people, one and the same, when talking about Ukrainians and Russians together. This is usually accompanied by such characteristics as one language, which is Russian language, one culture / religion, which is Orthodoxy and the entirety of the history, common history that Russia and Ukraine once had. Then, in addition to that, one history separately, as a separate characteristic, and also one economy and one law. And the latter two usually apply to the eastern regions of Ukraine, Donbas and Luhansk. This narrative appears quite consistently throughout the year too, but it concerns only regular people who are under constant threat from the government and the army. It is accompanied by such visuals as crying and frightened women and children or valiant, strong military commanders from the east of Ukraine. All of these people are victims, essentially, but it's not all that there is about them. There also can be happy people, women and men, young and old, celebrating holidays that Russia and Ukraine share, such as the Victory Day. Wearing Russian symbols proudly, such as the St. George's ribbon, and of course, speaking Russian. As I was thinking about all that I was seeing, what did the coexistence of demonization and positivity tell me? On the one hand, the government and the army, the pillars of the sovereign nation, are consistently delegitimized. They are clear villains. On the other, regular people are shown as suffering from the regime, and they're clear victims, being discussed and visualized as the same as Russians on top of that. So in my research, I conclude that this indicates that Ukrainian sovereignty was meticulously and deliberately denied on Russian television in 2021. And when the government and army are an illegitimate threat to the people who are essentially Russian, invasion stems not from greed for power, land, or influence, but from the right and obligation to protect your own, the same people as you. Which means that Ukrainians are not a nation in the Russian view. They're a people within a Russian nation. And the war, therefore, is a rightful act.
Thanks very much, Irina. And certainly I remember in 21 there was a lot of debate over, what Russia's intentions were. And, from what you're saying, in terms of the propaganda, the narratives, there was, there seems to be evidence of clear intent going back a long way before the invasion. So, Stephen, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the propaganda, the narratives produced about Ukraine in 2021, but for international audiences.
Yeah, so most of what I have to say is based on extensive research that I and my team did with or looking at the output of RT, Russia Today, Russia's primary tool of international propaganda, and its sister station, Sputnik. And you have to bear in mind that certainly up until the bans that were imposed in the aftermath of the invasion, those outlets were operating under European and indeed American kind of media legislation, and therefore they had to sort of adhere to the minimum standards required in those environments. And secondly, their audiences, or their intended audiences, were people who were very familiar with the kind of mainstream democratic Western narratives, and therefore couldn't be exposed to the kind of thing that Arina was describing, at least not to the same extent and not to the same intensity. So there is a sharp difference. Before I get to 2021, going back, there was a period 2014 to 2016 when RT covered an awful lot of about events in Ukraine, including the annexation of Crimea, which was celebrated as the return home of a people that had been crying out to rejoin their motherland, etc. There was also quite a lot of coverage of the repression of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. There was a backlash against RT's coverage. Some of you who remember back that far may remember there were one or two high-profile on-air protests, including a live resignation by Western presenters for whom this was a step too far, and who quite bravely kind of called Russia out and created a scandal. At the time, Russia was also indulging in the most extreme of disinformation, including the infamous story of the boy who was supposedly crucified in eastern Ukraine, which turned out to be complete fabrication. Disinformation about the downing of and I mean disinformation in the tight definitions I gave, the downing of the MH17 aircraft. So that was 2014 to 2016. Because of RT began to lose audiences very rapidly. And it's concerned about audiences, so it kind of stopped. And in the period that we studied, sort of 2019 to 2022, the coverage of Ukraine diminished. In fact, in the content analysis we did, barely 1% of coverage treated issues to do with Ukraine. There was a sort of drip of stories about the unfair treatment of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. There was a little flurry of activity around Hunter Biden and his nefarious or supposedly nefarious activities in Ukraine. There was a lot of kind of slow, steady undermining of the legitimacy of Zelensky. But it was on a relatively low scale. And therefore it didn't, I don't think to any audiences, appear to be preparing the ground for what we saw in February 2022. And indeed, throughout 2021, I don't think following RT's and Sputnik's output, you would have thought there was a prospect of an invasion. When we began, as you said, talking about and expressing concern, there was this build-up of troops. There were denials, and the good old Russophobia narrative kicked in. This is all Western Russophobia. I even sort of remember the Russian ambassador to the UK being interviewed on the eve of the invasion, being asked what's happening with all these troops building up, and can you comment? And it's all Western hysteria. It's Russophobia. Whether he actually knew what was planned or whether he was genuinely kept out in the dark. I'm not sure, but the coverage was rather different from what Irina describes. Although there were themes and narratives that she's articulated that were there in a kind of understated, diminished form, whilst RT attempted to get back its audience.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And yeah, it's very interesting how there was such a completely different form of messaging for the different audiences. So Pavel, I'm wondering, how did these messages, these narratives, how do they fit into the overall objectives of the Russian leadership?
And that is a very difficult question. I have to say that I am a consumer of Russian disinformation of different kind than Steve and Irina. Not a connoisseur, but definitely a consumer. Mostly experts' analysis, mostly kind of commentary of the sort. And what really struck me at that moment before the war was what Stephen describes in international audiences, how it was also aimed at domestic audiences. There could possibly be no war. No, it's all Western invention. Russia and Ukraine cannot be at war. A lot of kind of sound expert analysis on that. Certainly the tone of a lot of propaganda changed since the publication of Putin's article on Ukraine, written during his long self-isolation during COVID, because before that, generally the coverage of Zelensky in particular was generally quite neutral, and his election was generally even greeted because Poroshenko was seen as something much worse. Since the publication of the article, tone of kind of propaganda changed, and the idea of Russian and Ukraine being essentially one entity was coming up, but the war, no, absolutely impossible. And that's why Russia entered the war domestically so unprepared. Troops in the winter camps who were told that they were there for maneuvers were entirely unprepared. Domestic public opinion and propagandists themselves were entirely taken by surprise. For Putin, it was a special operation which need to be kind of kept in secret, but keeping it in secret from your own domestic audience and from your own troops, has its drawbacks, and that's why the initial period of war was so frankly disastrous for Russia, and that's why mobilization in the autumn of, in September, October of 22 was such a disaster of a different kind, when really so badly caused so much domestic resistance and so much immigration. So in this regard, Russian propaganda, which generally at that period had a lot of agency, certainly was disorienting its own domestic audience, not just international, quite significantly and quite profoundly, and kind of the beginning of the war, which Putin then justified as we had no choice, as we were kind of forced and pushed into that, was at that moment of the war entirely a huge surprise and shock for Russia.
Thanks very much, Pavel. I'd like to move on then to sort of current narratives. In particular for Stephen, we've got the Trump administration has been promoting negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And I'm wondering, how have these negotiations been portrayed by Russia, in material designed for global audiences?
Yeah, I guess there are sort of three broad points to make. Well, one is that any early triumphalism about Trump and what he meant for Russia has tended to kind of dissipate and be replaced by a much, much greater sense of caution and a realization that, as we all know, Trump is actually rather unpredictable and can't be relied on to deliver what certain domestic Russian propagandists, including Dugin, thought he was going to deliver. As recently as, I think it was yesterday, I follow some of these propagandists, as probably you do. Margarita Simonyan, still the editor-in-chief of RT, commented on the negotiations, current negotiations, said, I expect nothing much of them. I don't expect them to go anywhere. I'm a realist. Russia must carry on fighting. They've caught on to the fact that Trump blows hot and cold. And so I don't think there's any great store set by what is happening on the diplomatic front. As I say, there's this slightly kind of contradictory tension that's set in. So there's still a desire to believe that Trump has kind of changed the discourse, changed the prospects for Russia, but not in the way that had been hoped for initially. But the second point I wanted to make is there is a very, very clear still effort to draw a divide between America and Europe. So the output of RT, Sputnik, and indeed other Russian outlets facing outwards is now sort of full of stories about Europe's old elites and how they're dying, and how Trump is now putting paid to the lingering power of these old European elites. So an awful lot of very negative stories about European governments. The EU comes in, of course, for an awful lot of attacks, and this sort of ill-formulated European establishment. And Trump is still seen as the kind of fresh broom that is going to end forever the alliance between Europe and America. And very good that that's happening, but by no means any certainty about where it's all heading. And then thirdly, and so you can detect the sort of level of tension and contradiction in these messages. But the third sort of factor, and this brings in a new contradiction, is you have to remember that the likes of RT, Sputnik, and many other outward-facing Russian propaganda outlets have now retargeted their attention away from us, away from Western Europe, yes, towards Eastern Europe, where Russian propaganda is very, very active, aggressive, and where I think you can talk about a sort of level of influence. So RT Russian, for example, the output is very, very different from that of the other languages. And I think it, relatively speaking, it has much greater traction and is doing much greater damage. But of course, also for non-Russian output, English, French, Spanish, the primary audience is the global South, particularly Africa, where there's been a huge effort to redirect propaganda to those areas, and that of course creates a tension, because these areas don't think kindly of America, so they don't really respond to the kind of pro-Trump triumphalism that you get from Dugin and others. And I still have access to RT on my smartphone, full access, which is interesting. And the RT English, there was very little about the negotiations, a lot about what China is doing in India, a lot of warnings about the threat represented by China, and some fairly negative stories about Trump's immigration policy. So trying to kind of keep happy and adjust narratives to these three very, very different audiences is proving a challenge. And I think that is reflected in the kinds of tensions that I've tried to describe.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephen. And certainly the role of Russian propaganda, media activities in Africa is something that's had quite a dramatic effect in some countries, and definitely needs to be understood more. So, Irina, concerning the domestic Russian audience, how have the negotiations been portrayed in Russian media?
The 2025 negotiations are covered quite closely, I would say, and from what I've seen in the television coverage, Russians supposed to know a lot about these negotiations, almost to the tiniest details. But the overarching theme of the coverage is that these 2025 negotiations are portrayed as a direct continuation of what was halted in April 2022, of those negotiations that first took place in Belarus and then moved on to Istanbul. I've identified three trends of the coverage, three topics rather. First one is that Russia is a reliable partner and it is winning the war. The second is Ukraine is an unreliable partner and it is losing the war. And the third one is that the West is always meddling. The story goes roughly as follows. There's a lot of emphasis on the agreements from the end of March of 2022, which, according to the Russian television, were neutral status of Ukraine, so no NATO membership. Then the status of the Russian language in Ukraine, no foreign armies on the Ukrainian territory, and even the size of the Ukrainian army was allegedly agreed upon in Istanbul. So in 2025, Russia's demands are the same, except, and I'm quoting, the situation on the ground has changed dramatically. And here the television coverage, of course, refers to the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, and other regions that it has not really annexed. Nonetheless, Russia is ready for negotiations, even though she is winning, to achieve long-term peace and stop the bloodshed. There is a lot of negativity towards Ukraine and Zelensky within this type of coverage. Zelensky is presented as an illegitimate president and even referred to as expired at some points. But Russia is willing to overlook even this, provided the people who signed the agreement are legitimate, and it's the parliament of Ukraine or Verkhovna Rada. Then Ukraine is arming despite the ongoing peace talks. There was a lot of discussions about a deal that Ukraine signed with Germany about producing a long-range weaponry in Ukraine. The West, as I said, is meddling in the peace process, and specifically Russian propaganda has a serious beef with Boris Johnson, who supposedly encouraged Zelensky to withdraw from all the agreements at the end of March, April 2022. It's interesting that you, Stephen, mentioned Global South, because Global South is also mentioned in the coverage. And it's discussed as Russia's counterpart that welcomes the negotiations and understands that Russia is a good, reliable actor who strives for peace. There are discussions about allegedly abducted children from Ukraine, and these are usually sob stories about how Russia actually helps reunite Ukrainian families with their children who are suffering because of the war, with the help of Qatar. And it's usually women hugging crying children and sharing horror stories about how difficult it was to find their babies. Then there is a lot of emphasis on the prisoner exchange. There are stories about happy soldiers returning home and telling about how they were beaten up by Ukrainians as a parting gift. They're calling back to their families and having tearful conversations with them. And the coverage also emphasizes that medical, psychological, whatever kind of support and rehabilitation is required for these people, they will get it. The emphasis is also on the fact that Russia is returning civilians who are very happy to be home. It's mostly elderly women and people from Kursk Oblast. And all of these stories and themes are with the background of one success of the Russian military after the other. Failures such as the recent attack on the bridge in Crimea or the Operation Spiderweb, a drone attack on the Russian strategic fleet, are mentioned very, very briefly and always followed by the segments on the legitimate Russian response, whatever it shall be. Overall, the coverage of the negotiations looks much denser in 2025 than compared to 2022. On the days of negotiations this year, May 16 and June 2nd, as well as around them, there are usually 2-3 segments dedicated to the topic, and usually at the very beginning of the broadcast, so it's the theme of the day. It seems like it is important for the Russian government to over-explain to the domestic audiences how the negotiations are going and how Russia's joining them is a sign of goodwill, not concessions or yielding. With enough wiggle room to also demonstrate that these negotiations might not lead to anything, as Stephen also pointed out, but only because of Ukraine, not Russia. Either way, Russia will come out on top. Whereas in 2022, it was about the coverage was about the successes of SVO, first and foremost, and Russia's preparedness to face the sanctions and all the backlash and deal with it. And the last statement, in my opinion, Russian television is doing a very good job at tailoring the coverage to all domestic audiences, the peacemakers, the warmongers, and the indifferent ones. I would say that at this point, it's preparing domestic audiences for any outcome. The talks can go either way, and Russia is ready for anything.
Thanks very much, Irina. So I was wondering, Pavel, we've got these different narratives being portrayed to different audiences, in different languages. Can you sort of give us any insight in, what's being intended by that process and, all these different messages coming out?
Well, generally the intent is to preserve for the Russian leadership a freedom of choice. And definitely, unlike on our first round of discussion, the war makes a difference. In the war, disinformation is a norm. Is something you have kind of expected to do. Both sides do that, and can even argue that Ukrainians are more successful in that. In the last attack on Russian air bases, immediately the point about 41 destroyed bomber is coming up. It doesn't matter that it's more like 12. 41 is still something we all have heard about, so it's nearly a meme. Which is generally a success for kind of Ukrainian propaganda. What we can deduce from the kind of Russian coverage of that, what is the real intention? Again, the real intention are definitely hard to figure out. It's clear that the regime is fighting in this war for its survival. It's existential. War stakes are much greater than they are often presumed to be in the West. It's not about kind of territory, really. It's about something greater. One consequence, which probably wasn't quite intended in this coverage, is that in the Russian populace, in the kind of last few months, there were indeed new hopes for ending of the war, and these hopes produced a new inflow of volunteers into the army. People were signing contracts, expecting to get the bonus, to make your family happy, and then the war ends, you are safe. And it's obviously not going to happen, so probably we can expect that the kind of spike in the recruitment would be followed by a decline, and that probably might be a significant impact on the sustainability of the war. But as for the intentions in these negotiations, it is clear that for the Kremlin, the talks are just continuation of the war by other means. They want to bring the war to a victorious end, combining sustained pressure and some negotiations primarily aimed at disorienting the enemy, at splitting the Western coalition.
Thanks very much, Pavel. I'd like to move on then to the sort of wider cultural political implications. So, for example, for Stephen, what has been the role of Russian narratives, propaganda, etc., in shaping the media landscape in Europe? I mean, for example, I recall from before 22. RT was quite successful at taking quite marginal figures and giving them a much more prominent platform. So I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, again, there's several things to say. Well, first, the bans and access restrictions have certainly affected the capacity of Russian state media actors to infiltrate Western media space. That said, I don't think they've enjoyed sort of undiluted success. As I mentioned, I can readily check RT in every language available on my phone, and I do so every morning without anyone stopping me. Like a lot of you, I'm on X, though increasingly sort of wondering whether I should stay. But one reason why I stay is because, I can now follow Russian propaganda. So Simanyan is a very, very active poster on X. I do now still find, begin to find posts from RT. This is no doubt thanks to the generosity of Elon Musk and his new regime for X. Moreover, RT has, rather than completely stopping trying to target Western audiences, it has now migrated, certainly in America, to certain of these kind of alt-right platforms, like Rumble, for example, where you can follow RT news coverage at your will, and the hit rate is actually quite substantial. So first thing to say is we haven't managed completely to kind of suppress RT's activities in Western media space. As I was mentioning before, it is very much a presence in Eastern Europe. Serbia, now you can watch RT on television. It's opened a new channel. And other countries which I think are really under bombardment from Russian propaganda narratives and media outlets include Moldova, I think, and the Baltics still, and to a lesser extent Armenia. Telegram is used very actively and quite successfully in those areas, which isn't the case in Western domains. But the third thing to say is that in order to circumvent these restrictions, the Kremlin has launched very substantive networks of proxies and mirror websites. These were uncovered by the Operation Doppelganger. I think the French Counter-Disinformation Agency had a significant role in covering these really quite large networks of sites that don't, on the face of it, appear to have any connection to Russia, but in fact are proxies of Russia, and the mirroring, the setting up of websites that look, to all intents and purposes, like those of the Wall Street Journal or Le Monde. Both of those were victims of this mirroring tactic. They were very soon shut down, but then they just sort of restarted again with a different domain name. So it's a bit of a game of cat and mouse. They use AI and computer-driven kind of automation to generate vast amounts of content. I mean, the Pravda network, for example, which is the biggest and which is available across all languages of Europe, it's literally news stories every minute. You can't keep up. These stories, however, they're parasitic. They use AI tools, actually like other broadcasters do, to steal content from elsewhere and sometimes with a minimal of rebadging. but it allows them to operate at scale. That being the case, relatively little of it meets my sort of tight definition of disinformation. Some of it barely even meets the definition of propaganda. It is just journalistic, parasitic news content. And the last thing to say is, because we have, two last things. One is that we have studied these networks, their output, but also the traction. And certainly as far as Western Europe is concerned, the traction is at best modest. They have very, very low kind of view rates. The Telegram channels associated have sometimes no subscribers, so they're there kind of performatively. And I think part of the purpose of these networks is actually not to kind of brainwash us, but to make a statement. We're here, whether you like it or not, and by all means pay attention to us. First of all, it allows us to go back to the Kremlin and say, look, they're noticing us. And secondly, it distracts resources, including from people like me who've just spent weeks kind of studying them. So I think it has to be taken somewhat with a pinch of salt. And finally, there have been stories, and actually kind of well-researched stories, including by NewsGuard, which is a very kind of credible and well-respected counter-disinformation NGO, to suggest that Russia has succeeded in toxifying ChatGPT with Russian narratives, so that if you ask it a question about what's happening in Ukraine, you'll get that's the first sort of most prominent response will be a Russian propaganda narrative. In fact, I think it has to be taken with a large pinch of salt. We've tested those claims, and we've found that the only way of actually getting Russian propaganda content back is if you task it so precisely and in a manner that no ordinary person would think of instructing ChatGPT. And then what you actually get, if you ask what's happening in Ukraine now, you may get these propaganda. The first thing that comes up is the rebuttals. Because, these AI tools, they rely on what's out there, and far more prominent than the Russian propaganda itself is the rebuttal. So I think there's a point I'm making is that whilst it is somewhat alarming to see the amount of resources Russia has invested into these operations, there's a question mark over their efficacy, certainly as far as Western European space is concerned, and there's a danger in overinflating the effects.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephen. And certainly, it's important to bear in mind that qualification. Especially if we're worried about attempts to influence generative AI that may not be successful.
They may get better at it.
Yeah, certainly.
So one shouldn't be complacent.
Certainly, and an awful lot of resources were put into trying to influence the result of Google search results, for example. Yeah. So we may see similar resources put in. Yeah. So, Irina, I was wondering, in terms of your research on media within Russia, what are the implications for Russian society, for people's values? To what extent, for example, is attempts to get Russians to support the war, are they successful or not?
Yes, the level of support is at steady 60 to 70%, according to different polls. Both independent and government affiliated in Russia. And you would think that these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt at least, but not really. Independent research shows that preference falsification or the internalized desire to adhere to the commonly accepted viewpoint because of peer pressure, shows that 70% of Russians, when asked directly about whether they support the war, say yes. But when asked indirectly, 60% say the same. 10 points is a significant difference, so it is relevant, which shows that there is indeed preference classification, but its level is not as high as one would perhaps hope or want. So the logical question is, why is the level of support so high, and would it remain? I can only hypothesize based on what I have researched. First, there is the Ukrainians as Russians narrative that I mentioned. What does it really say about how Russians see themselves, their values? There have been arguments made that othering is a commonly used technique of nation and identity building. So we as a nation are who we are because they, the other, are not the same as us. I don't really see this playing out here. It's saming, if you will. We are who we are because they are the same as us, in a way. And in this paradigm, Russians do not see themselves as invaders, but as saviors on a rightful mission. The narrative suggests that Russians are a nation that always protects their own, and that also protects the world from Nazism. So they're the good guys. But what makes one their own in the Russian view? It's language, culture, history, and religion, and only partially, economic ties and citizenship. But the latter two, in my mind, are less important than the sort of softer cultural and historical elements that point towards unity. Essentially, the argument might go as follows. There are Russian-speaking people all over the world whose rights might be endangered or are already endangered. They are not allowed to speak Russian, for example. They have the same cultural views as the Russians living in Russia and the same religion. And the kicker, historically, the lands on which these people live now were once Russia. And here I am speaking, of course, about such countries as Estonia, Finland, Latvia. No one in these countries protects these people and their rights to be Russians. So what's to stop Putin from invading them too? This is, of course, highly speculative, but my point is that this argumentation might be there in the Russian media to serve as a potential indicator of where Russian policy might go. And another question is if this scenario, this potential invasion were to play out, would Russians at home actually accept another war? Going back to the current television coverage in Russia, I think that the war and its ramifications for the culture, the society, and economy are overwhelming in the medium, and they're overwhelmingly positive. Almost everything that an average TV viewer in Russia sees about the war is positive. How the country is adapting to and thriving under sanctions, how Russian army is liberating one town after another, how the society and the government support and integrate the SVO veterans. Russian society seems to be more and more militarized, and it is a society, therefore, of war that seems to have learned to live with it and apparently to support it. For how long this can continue, and if it can at all, I don't know, but this is really worrisome.
Thanks very much, Irina. Definitely worrisome. But Pavel, how do you think the Russian leadership perceives all of these activities? Does it see them as being successful, or as Stephen was saying, maybe they're aware that at least outside of Russia they may not be having a huge effect in some places?
Well, definitely it's the main purpose of Russian propagandists to impress their own leadership. That they are successful. It's kind of not really any measure of impact factor on your audience. It's very much selling your product to the one consumer that matters. Yeah. And it's not that easy now to do that because even Russian propaganda understands that generally the flow of fake news generated in Washington, D.C. is far greater than what they're able to produce. So there is a different reference point. Not a single story produced by Russian propaganda can compare in impact with a plain point about immigrants eating dogs in Ohio, or was it Pennsylvania? I can't remember. So there is a really different impact altogether. And I think what is new for Russian measure of success is that they suddenly discover that in US policy, there is a very distinct line now about connecting with so-called civilizational allies in Europe. New document from the State Department. And this allies, civilizational, happen to be mostly the same forces who are generally positive towards Russia. From Orban in Hungary to Alternative for Deutschland in Germany to kind of right-wing conservatives in Romania. Probably only in Poland there is an exception. So there is now this new meeting of minds, so to say, between Russian propaganda and what happenings in transatlantic relations. There is a kind of ability to strike some resonance. You know, if a decade or so ago, one of Russian oligarchs, Yakunin, opened in Germany a think tank called Dialogue of Civilizations. It wasn't very successful, but nevertheless worked even through the period of mid-2010s when the already was the beginning of the war in Ukraine and tensions with the West and beginning of sanctions. They continued, they were shut down only after the full-blown invasion. Well, they might be reopened again now. A different name, Dialogue of Civilizations, is exactly what the doctor ordered. So I think that some new measures of success might be discovered now in the Kremlin, some new opportunities and possibilities. That's what worrisome for me.
Thanks very much, Pavel. So for the final round of questions, I'd like to ask about sort of policy responses, particularly, Stephen, for democracies which value freedom of speech, freedom of expression. How can such societies, such governments try to counter propaganda, disinformation? You know, would some forms of censorship, I mean, you've discussed shutting down RT, for example, but also that maybe they don't work so well, and again, you know, they're controversial in itself. So I was wondering if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, some of what I would respond has come up in discussion earlier. Maybe the one or two few new points as well. Yeah, I think censorship of any kind has to be sort of implemented only in sort of certain circumstances and with extreme circumspection, not just because it goes against our own liberal values, but because it potentially and actually plays into Russian narratives. I forgot to mention that as part of its kind of rebranding operation, RT has a new logo. It used to be Question More. So the idea is, you know, we should all be questioning what our governments are telling us. It's now truth over censorship, truth, reality over narratives. It's not quite as catchy as Question More, but you get the idea. So RT and actors like it have been very adept in kind of making use and exploiting our responses to them for their own purposes, and we probably better not try to give them too much ammunition to do so. Yeah, as I said before, that we have to be careful not to inflate influence and impact when it really isn't there, which isn't a sort of message of complacency. I think we have to be very, very attentive and attuned to what Russia is doing very actively and much more successfully in other areas of cyber security, industrial sabotage, and some ways most worrying to me of all is sort of covert political influence. Those are activities that we really need to kind of keep a watch and address as most effectively as we can. I'm less concerned about the Pravda network and its impact in Western media space. I also think that, yes, sort of try to kind of bring in some of what I said earlier. When we're talking about these issues, we need to be precise in our use of terminology and not to sort of group everything under Russian disinformation. It just plays into Russia's own narratives. They now have a burgeoning counter-disinformation industry of their own. And you know, I think Pavel was correct to talk about Ukrainian propaganda and Russian propaganda. That's the sort of kind of precision and kind of objectivity that we need in order to make a good job of tracking and analysing this material. Three other very quick points, perhaps most important of all. What Russia, certainly in terms of its engagement in Western media space does, is it mines, well, Pavel was kind of hinting at this, populist right narratives that are there already, that didn't come from Russia, that we created ourselves. And there's a difference here between the old Soviet kind of approach, where they also mined the Western press for useful corroboration of their own Marxist-Leninist analysis of the ills of Western society. They no longer seek corroboration, they seek inspiration. So if we're really going to get a handle on this, then we really need to pay attention to our to the causes and reasons for the counter-establishment populist insurgency here. Russia is really it inserts itself into those spaces rather than bombards it with new disinformation. It kind of borrows and adapts and converges with and merges with those actors. And I think that needs to be borne in mind. In terms of active measures, I've sort of ruled out or expressed reservations about censorship. It seems to me that counter-messaging can be very helpful. I'm struck by the fact that just as, and I think you're probably having this debate in Norway as well, ramping up spending on kind of military capacity, at the very point we're doing that in Britain, and I support those efforts, the government has cut funding to BBC World Service. And BBC World Service was a very powerful corrective to Russian propaganda activities, particularly in the global south, where now it more or less has free rein. And that is really worrying. So I think if we're really serious about sort of addressing Russian propaganda, we should look at counter-messaging and targeting it where it's needed. Finally, just something just to throw out there, and I realise this may strike some of you as sort of completely kind of idealistic and
nothing wrong with some idealism.
Yeah. The problem or the source of much disinformation propaganda, as we all know, is not the BBC. It's not broadcast. It's social media platforms. And we all know the problems with the business models that are employed by social media platforms and how they naturally kind of entice and attract disinformation, conspiracy theories, and so on. Is there any possibility of a public service social media platform initiative in Europe, for example, where Norway, Britain, Sweden, other countries have good public service broadcasters still, although the BBC is sort of somewhat under the cosh. Is that completely out of the question? Because if there were a way of doing that, then that might be a very kind of powerful. I completely understand the problems with that suggestion. And I'm just putting it out there as a sort of provocation.
Yeah, certainly algorithms that weren't designed to induce anger and rage might be better for all of us. But Irina, concerning the Russian domestic society, you have attempts at sort of counter messaging from Russian opposition activists who are located outside of Russia. To what extent are they able to reach audiences within Russia?
I think they can reach audiences in Russia, but before I get to that, I think it's first important to establish why would they want to do this. What is the purpose of reaching domestic audiences for the Russian opposition? And broadly speaking, I would say that one of the first reasons would be offering them an alternative point of view and therefore engaging in some sort of information war with the state-owned media, that is television predominantly. Another purpose would be showing liberal Russians that they are not alone, that they have representation abroad, and therefore helping foster a community, sort of at a large distances, but still a community of sorts. Or is the purpose of reaching the Russian audiences about petty squabbles between the different sides of the opposition? You would think that the first two reasons are the first two purposes are the obvious ones, but it also feels to me that what the Russian opposition is actually doing is trying to settle who the leader is, and this is playing out on social media. So there are media by FBK or by Anti-Corruption Fund, which was founded by Navalny. Its YouTube channels, such as Navalny Live, with 3.5 million subscribers, launched in 2017. And there's a channel, Popular Politics, with 2.9 million subscribers, launched in 2022 on the basis of another of Navalny's channels. The views on the videos of the former channel are in between 500,000, of the second between 70,000 100,000. So the reach is there. There are also media by social media by Mikhail Khodorkovsky. For instance, Khodorkovsky Live, another YouTube channel, also with 2.9 million subscribers and with views in between 80 to 250,000 per video. So the reach is kind of okay, but not really comparable to the Russian television, because according to different researchers, there is about 63% of Russian population which watches television every day, and this is substantially more than 250,000 people. So the purpose of these media is to inform and offer an alternative point of view, but also to settle scores with each other, regretfully. There was this YouTube film produced by FBK, as some of you might know, in 2024 called The Traitors, which looked a lot like a personal attack on Khodorkovsky and caused a lot of discussion in the liberal segment of the Russian internet. But besides this social media presence, there is also a very curious phenomenon of organized anti-war protests, which are held outside of Russia. There have been two so far. One took place on November 17 in 2024, and the other quite recently on March 1st, 2025. Both took place in Berlin. They were both organized quite meticulously by the leaders of the Russian opposition. Unlike the more spontaneous anti-war protests of early 22 and the ones that followed later across the world and in Russia, and I'm sure many of you participated in those too. There was a thorough social media campaign in 2024 and 2025 to encourage people to join and to host solidarity events in their own cities, obviously outside of Russia. And for the event in November, between 2,000 and 4,000 people showed up. For the event in March, about 500, and I'm speaking about Berlin. I don't have data for other cities in Europe and the US, for example. So the impact is small, but it's still an impact. But I interpret these events as the ones designed to actually show domestic audiences who do not support Putin and the war that they are not alone in their beliefs, and that there are people who represent them and who speak for them, even if they're not at home. And surprisingly, about 30% of Russians did know about the first event, at least in November, despite the fact that the Russian information flow at home is tightly controlled these days. So in my view, reaching domestic audiences is possible, obviously only via the internet and considering the social media landscape of the country. But the question is why you're reaching them. The media empires, so to speak, that FBK and Khodorkovsky have built, they're not enough to foster a strong anti-war, anti-Putin, pro-democratic community. And this community is what is essentially needed for some sort of change to at least have a chance at occurring in Russia.
Thanks very much, Irina. So Pavel, another method of countering propaganda activities would be to try to persuade the Russian leadership to stop doing that. Is there any policy measures that could be taken by, say, European governments to exert some influence there? Or
certainly, impact on the leadership is very difficult, particularly in absence of any high-level contact. And it's very clear that in the Russian leadership, the understanding that Russia is at war with the collective West and with Europe in particular is very strong. And in war, every means are great. You know, whatever you need to do to achieve the victory. It is. There are nuances certainly in this war. Very recently we had the kind of very strong emphasis on the Anglo-Saxon conspiracy and hostility, Russophobia. Anglo-Saxon was the key word. It's completely gone now because there is certain deference to President Trump. There's an attempt to be kind of respectful, to play all sort of tactical games. But it is really a nuance which doesn't change the substance. What I want to emphasize is that in this whole kind of hybrid domain of confrontation between Russia and Europe, Russia is not really that good. Russia is not yes, it's important to monitor, to counter, to follow up and to disprove. But if you look at kind of most important, most kind of impactful events in the West, okay, electric shutdown in Spain and Portugal wasn't of Russia's making. And Heathrow was shut down also not because of Russian conspiracy. Yes, Russians are trying to do this and that, but by and large, the reach is not that great. And there are a lot of vulnerabilities inside Russia particularly as far as cyberspace is concerned. Russia is not a great cyber power at all. And you hear very often about Russian hacker attacks, this and that, but the impact inside Russia on Russian so-called digital governance is huge. So I think for the West, in this contestation, it's very important to be more proactive. I don't mean proactive like Ukraine was, kind of killing Russian patriotic bloggers. That's going too far. But there are a lot of kind of proactive steps which needs to be taken. And if it is one I would particularly recommend is keeping Radio Free Europe active. Shutting it down from the United States is a kind of colossal blunder. The European Union and other European states can keep that medium, which I think is doing a great job in business, and that would be kind of one important practical step.
Thanks very much, Pavel. I'd like to thank, as the moderator, the three of you for your impeccable timekeeping, because we now have about 15 minutes for some questions from the audience. I would like to say first, we've got a traveling microphone at the back there, so please, if you have a question, could you use the microphone? That's because we've got an online audience as well, and they won't hear the question if you don't use the microphone. And also be aware that, as well as being live streamed, this event is being recorded, so yeah, try not to swear when you're asking the questions, or at least if you do swear, do that in the knowledge that people are going to hear you. So if I start with a group of three questions, I see the man in the red T-shirt at the back there.
Yes, you seem very worried about Russian propaganda and disinformation, but I think you're not quite aware that you yourself are part of the NATO propaganda. Are you? Well, I represent actually the only peace party in Norway, not in the parliament yet, but there's still only war parties in the parliament, so we hope for something better in September. But supposing we all want peace, I wonder if Peace Research Institute Oslo, how do you think you contribute to peace with only amplifying the propaganda that's in all of the Norwegian media? Why don't make an effort for a sort of pointing at the NATO propaganda, the notion that Russia's invasion was unprovoked and that Ukraine was a peaceful country and all those silly notions.
Thanks very much for your point, and I can just point out that as an institution, PRIO doesn't take a position on anything. We all have we all have individual positions, but at no point does the management tell us what to say. Okay, we can move on. Yes, I saw you next.
Thanks so much for an insightful discussion. Natalia Remeva is my name, the European Markland Center. What I was just wondering was pointed out in a quite good way how the Russian propaganda is being diversified for different audiences within Russia, and you slightly mentioned also within the Europe, and particularly in the Eastern and Central European countries. But at the same time, pointing out that the Western narrative of Russophobia probably generally is well spread here in Europe. Do you probably notice some of the nuances that are specific for different countries? Well, my experience usually goes when we speak with the colleagues in Poland, for example, and compare how Russian propaganda works in the Norwegian and Polish context, that I was quite surprised to hear that the Polish colleagues usually point out that Russian propaganda is particularly directed towards Ukrainian refugees. And this is the discourse that is very topical over there, while here in Norway we did not notice it at all, even though some of the narratives about the refugees being the burden for the society, they do exist here in Norway as well. But in Poland, by the fact checkers, for example, they're being pointed out as direct influence of the Russian propaganda. And here I completely agree with Steven. I'm also very skeptical sometimes into not falling into putting everything under one umbrella, whatever bad things or the things that we do not like happening, or the information being spread. We should not immediately call it Russian propaganda just because we do not agree with it or think that it has a negative impact. So would you just elaborate a little bit if you have noticed the differences in different European countries, particularly Western and Central European countries, on the way the Russian narratives work? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Do we have a third question? I saw this gentleman first.
Thank you. My name is Jonas Iversen. I work at the UN Association of Norway. I'm wondering about the opinions about Ukrainians inside the occupied territories of the Russian occupied territories in Ukraine, and their opinions towards Russia, and how the Russian propaganda has kind of targeted them. Thank you.
Okay, I'll let the panelists answer those three questions, and if the three of you can be brief, we may have time to answer. To ask a few more. So, if Irina, if you start off.
I don't have much to answer to these questions, but thank you for asking them. I think Stephen and Pavel can contribute more to this discussion.
That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, the first question, I think I would probably push back a little bit against the idea that we are ourselves kind of encouraging and promoting Russian propaganda. I think, listening to the two colleagues, we were generally sort of quite cautious about the kind of sort of hysterical, simplistic version of events in terms of what Russia is doing, and we were pleading for a certain kind of objectivity, impartiality, and putting forward ideas, positive ideas for counter messaging, and rather than necessarily kind of following the warmongering kind of simplistic line that I've kind of heard in your question, but that obviously that conversation can be continued at infinitum. But you're right. The question about adaptation and calibration. Certainly, Russia's external-facing media outlets do take trouble to and put effort into calibrating narratives for particular environments. And sometimes they will use different sets of narratives altogether, depending on whom they're targeting. You know, you mentioned Ukrainian narratives Ukrainian migrants in Poland. Elsewhere, there tends to be a focus on Muslim migrants, playing into and often quite openly endorsing versions of the so-called Great Replacement theory, which again is not a Russian narrative, but it serves Russian purposes very well in certain environments, including Britain and Italy and elsewhere. I speak French and I follow French output sponsored by Russia, and yes, there's a lot of messaging about French imperialism in Africa, and so the kind of anti-imperialist narrative is calibrated and adapted depending on who the target audience is, and that's important to note. I don't really have much to say about the targeting of the occupied territories. I wonder whether Irina, you might know more about.
To be honest, no. The only thing I do know is that television coverage in those areas is Russian coverage. So they would listen to the same things that I have talked about, but I don't know any hard data on what the views over there are, regretfully.
Yes, on the first question. You know, after more than 30 years in Norway, I still take this war very personally. It's not about pre-opposition. For me, Russia is not a foreign country. And seeing that country guilty in the crime of aggression is a pain. And I am feeling always this war as something I need to confront in every way I can. And I know that there cannot be peace with Russia until it's Putin's Russia. Every measure aimed at defeating that aggression needs to be mobilized. And for that matter, the difference you've mentioned in Russian propaganda, I think one failure of Russian propaganda, big one, is the Nordic area, Nordic-Baltic. Not a single political force here resonates with Russian propaganda, and Russians are quite surprised with that. Because generally there were a lot of good neighborly feeling in Finland. There were a lot of positive feelings toward Russia in northern Norway. So in principle, the communities, the audiences, Russia expect to be here and to be vocal and to be useful. They cannot find any. They are focusing very much on Germany. They are very keen to exploring opportunities in Romania and Bulgaria. Serbia certainly is a point. But overall, portraying Europe and Northern Europe in particular as the enemy, I think is something Russian propaganda is kind of putting a strong emphasis on, and in many ways it is counterproductive. As far as some special messages and special efforts in the occupied territories, certainly Crimea is different in this respect. And the difference is huge between kind of Donbass and recently occupied territories, and between all this and Crimea, where kind of Russian propaganda is exploiting a lot of local support. And I think one particular painful issue in the newly occupied territories is certainly children, which in Russian official propaganda, Russian children, it's Russian territory. It's kind of is no issue at all. And that continues to resonate on the human level in different ways. So I think this nuance will reflect even in the negotiations which are going on, and where Russian propaganda is kind of really trying to maneuver around that. But the fundamental crime remains plain obvious.
Okay, thank you. We have a few minutes, so I can see three people. If you could limit yourselves to 30 seconds each to ask a question, and then we have enough time. So you, the gentleman at the back. There.
Yeah, hi. I'm also with the Party for Peace and Justice Norway. I think we can all agree here that all states conduct propaganda, which of course Norway is by no means an exception to this. And Russia, of course, also conducts propaganda, and sometimes very stupid propaganda. But what I was wondering is that is proof for the existence of Russian propaganda a valid excuse for not seeking to understand Russia's core security concerns and actually trying to find a negotiated settlement in this war, which seems to me the only solution? Because here you talk a lot about propaganda, but what about that?
Thank you.
Is it an excuse?
Thank you for your brevity. You, the gentleman there.
Well, hi. Thank you for your time. I'm being, as a Pavel, also sort of a consumer of Russian propaganda for the sake of sport and fun. And I would like to ask, there was dropped a few times the D word, Dugin word. But in this conversation, it was sort of said very little. But I think it can be a very important part of discussion. So if it's possible, we have not a lot of time, also say something about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And you, sir.
Yeah, my name is Jørn Holm Hansen from the Oslo Metropolitan University. When propaganda is efficient, then it comes with a grain of truth. And even Russian propaganda at times does that. And sometimes we do not want to, in a way, when they do it, it becomes a non-go zone for us because we do not want to support Russian propaganda. It could be, linguistic rights of Russian speakers. It might be Ukrainian memory politics. Of course, Russia is quite hypocritical criticizing these things, but still, this is a problem for some of us who would like to discuss these things without in any way supporting Russia. Do you have any ideas of how to cope with this?
Thanks. And of course, that's something that the panelists have also mentioned as well. Okay, I give you each 30 seconds. If you can keep it to that, we'd like to keep on schedule, if that's possible to be so brief.
Yes, I think answering the question about propaganda and peace talks, taking Russian security concerns into account. Certainly when propaganda in Russia is used for derailing the talks, for explaining away a Russian irreconcilable position in the negotiations, there is very little where point of connection can be established. And I do think that the point about addressing Russian legitimate security concern is important, but it cannot be stretched to justifying Russian occupation of the 5 Ukrainian regions. And that's point which in the Russian negotiation position is right in the center. Rejecting that point, means that very little remains to be discussed in the talks. Sorry.
Stephen, please.
Yeah, I won't follow that up in detail, except to say that yes, certainly Russia's position needs to be understood, and eventually there will need to be some kind of mutual coming together and understanding. But it seems to me that we're dealing with a bad faith actor, and
Yes.
it is difficult to negotiate with a bad faith actor. But you're right, and the other question was right, that we need to be careful and precise about our use of the term propaganda and recognise that, yes, we all do propaganda. You mentioned Ukraine. The term propaganda, historically, has not always had a negative connotation. The very first propaganda institute was set up in America, and the term did not have that kind of sort of automatically kind of negative association with it. And so I am making a plea to return to that kind of approach. And I think you're also right in saying that propaganda works because often it does have a grain of truth, but also it appeals to particular sentiments. And it often resonates with much deeper, long-standing historical narratives. And, studying Russian propaganda, the narratives that work tend to be the ones that have a long historical lineage and resonate with ordinary Russians. And that is, again, it's true of propaganda anywhere. And that is part of the tool set that we need to use to understand it, to understand how it uses facts and truth, but also how it works with sentiments and with these so-called deep narratives that are embedded in every culture.
Thanks very much. And Irina, for the last word.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I second what Pavel and Stephen are saying about the fact that it's important to understand the causes. But what is even more important when you are trying to understand the causes and are considering them is also trying to discern what in these causes was caused by the truth and what in these causes was fueled by myths and lies. And this is where research is important. This is where historical work, media research, policy analysis are crucial. Because what is truth is a relative question. Truth is, we have this ideal of truth and we want it to be one single thing, but it's not. And usually it's somewhere in the middle, and I think that research is where that middle ground is found and established.
There was I would strongly recommend that you all go back and read Hannah Arendt's very famous essay about truth and politics. It was written sort of decades and decades ago. It's really powerful and really insightful. And one of the many, many excellent points she makes is that we're suspicious of truth because it imposes upon us something that we cannot question. And that is as problematic in democratic societies. We don't like to be told there is the truth and it is absolute and it is coming from above and it cannot be questioned. So when deciding what a disinformation is and how to combat it, one has to keep the counter notion of truth in mind and what one understands by it and how complex and multifaceted it is.
Thanks very much for that, and thanks to all the three of you.